Hey guys, it's Jordan, aka Miss Haynes' daughter, and today I'm going to be reading In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, pages 52 through 66. I'm going to be starting at the bottom of page 52 at The Travelers Stopped. The travelers stopped for dinner at a restaurant in Great Bend. Perry, down to his last $15, was ready to settle for root beer and a sandwich, but Dick said no. They needed a solid tuck-in and never mind the cost. The tab was his. They ordered 2 steaks, medium rare, baked potatoes, french fries, fried onions, succotash, which is like okra fried stuff. It's like tomatoes. Side dishes of macaroni and hominy, salad with Thousand Island dressing, cinnamon rolls, apple pie and ice cream, and coffee. I don't know about y'all, but I don't know how they were able to eat that much. To top it off, they visited a drugstore and selected cigars. In the same drugstore, they also bought two thick rolls of adhesive tape. As the black Chevrolet regained the highway and hurried on across the countryside, imperceptibly ascending towards the colder, cracker-dry climate of the high wheat plains, Harry closed his eyes and dozed off into a food-dazed semi-slumber from which he woke to hear a voice reading the 11 o'clock news. Imperceptibly means that you're doing something gradually, so nobody can really see what you're doing, and you're trying to do it secretly. He rolled down a window and bathed his face in the flood of frosty air. Dick told him they were in Finney County. "We crossed the line 10 miles back," he said. The car was going very fast. Signs, their messages ignited by the car's headlights, flared up, flew by. "See the polar bears! Burtis Motors, world's largest free swimming pool. Wheatlands Motel." And finally, a bit before street lamps began, "Howdy, stranger! Welcome to Garden City, a friendly place." They skirted the northern rim of the town. No one was abroad at this nearly midnight hour, and nothing was open except a string of desolately bright service stations. Desolate means there's not really anybody in a certain place. It's pretty empty. Dick turned into one. "Here's Phillips 66. A youngster appeared and asked, "Fill her up?" Dick nodded, and Perry, getting out of the car, went inside the station where he locked himself in the men's room. His legs pained him, as they often did. They hurt as though his old accident had happened 5 minutes before. He shook 3 aspirins out of a bottle, chewed them slowly, for he liked the taste, and then drank water from the basin tap. He sat down on the toilet, stretched out his legs, and rubbed them, massaging the almost unbendable knees. Dick had said they were almost there, only 7 miles more. He unzippered a pocket of his windbreaker and brought out a paper sack. Inside it were the recently purchased rubber gloves. They were glue-covered, sticky and thin, and he inched them on. One tore, not a dangerous tear, just a split between the fingers, but it seemed to him an omen. An omen is like when something bad's gonna happen. The doorknob turned, rattled. Dick said, "Want some candy? They got a candy machine out here." "No." "You okay?" "I'm fine." "Don't be all night." Dick dropped a dime in a vending machine, pulled the lever, and picked up a bag of jelly beans. Munching, he wandered back to the car and lounged there watching the young attendant's efforts to rid the windshield of Kansas dust and the slime of battered insects. The attendant, whose name was James Spoor, felt uneasy. Dick's eyes and sullen expression in Perry's strange, prolonged sojourn in the lavatories disturbed him. The next day, he reported to his employer, "We had some tough customers in here last night," but he did not think, then or for the longest while, to connect the visitors with the tragedy in Holcomb. Dick said, "Kinda slow around here." "Sure is," James Spoor said. "You're the only body stopped here since 2 hours. Where you coming from?" "Kansas City." "Here to hunt?" "Just passing through, on our way to Arizona. We got jobs waiting there. Construction work." "Any idea the mileage between here and Tucumari, Mexico?" "Can't say I do. $3.06. He accepted Dick's money and made change, and said, "You'll excuse me, sir? I'm doing the job, putting a bumper on a truck." Dick waited, ate some jelly beans, impatiently gunned the motor, sounded the horn. Was it possible that he had misjudged Perry's character? That Perry, of all people, was suffering a sudden case of blood bubbles? A year ago, when they first encountered each other, he thought Perry a good guy, if a bit stuck on himself, sentimental, too much the dreamer. He had liked him, but not considered him especially worth cultivating until, one day, Perry described a murderer, telling how simply for the hell of it, he had killed a colored man in Las Vegas, beaten him to death with a bicycle chain. The anecdote elevated Dick's opinion of little Perry. He began to see more of him, and, like Willie J., though for dissimilar reasons, gradually decided that Perry possessed unusual and valuable qualities. Several murderers, or men who boasted of murder or their willingness to commit it, circulated inside Lansing. But Dick became convinced that Perry was that rarity, a natural killer, absolutely sane but conscienceless, incapable of dealing, with or without motive, the coldest blooded death blows. books. It was Dick's theory that such a gift could, under his supervision, be profitably exploited. Having reached this conclusion, he had proceeded to woo Perry, flatter him, pretend, for example, that he believed all the buried treasure stuff and shared his beachcomber yearnings and seaport longings, none of which appealed to Dick, who wanted a regular life with a business of his own, a house, a horse to ride, a new car, and plenty of blonde chicken. It was important, however, that Perry not suspect this, not until Perry, with his gift, had helped further Dick's ambitions. But perhaps it was Dick who had miscalculated, been duped. If so, if it developed that Perry was, after all, only an ordinary punk, then the party was over. The months of planning were wasted. There was nothing to do but turn and go. It mustn't happen. Dick returned to the station. The door to the men's room was still bolted. He banged on it. "For Christ's sakes, Perry! In a minute! What's the matter? You sick?" Perry gripped the edge of the wash basin and hauled himself to a standing position. His legs trembled, the pain in his knees made him perspire. He wiped his face with a paper towel. He unlocked the door and said, "Okay, let's go." Nancy's bedroom was the smallest, most personal room in the house, girlish and as frothy as a ballerina's tutu. Walls, ceilings, and everything else except a bureau and a writing desk were pink or blue, or white. The white and pink bed, piled with blue pillows, was dominated by a big pink and white teddy bear, a shooting gallery prize that Bobby had won at the county fair. A cork bulletin board, painted pink, hung above a white-skirted dressing table. Dry gardenias, the remains of some ancient corsage, were attached to it, and Valentine's newspaper recipes and snapshots of her baby nephew and of Susan Kidwell, and of Bobby Rupp. Bobby cut in a dozen actions, swinging a bat, dribbling a basketball, driving a tractor, wading, in bathing trunks, at the edge of McKinney Lake, which was as far as he dared to go, for he had never learned to swim. And there were photographs of the two together, Nancy and Bobby. Of these, she liked best one that showed him sitting in a leaf-dappled light amid picnic debris and looking at one another with expressions that, though unsmiling, seemed mirthful and full of delight. Other pictures of horses, of cats deceased but unforgotten, like poor Boobs, who had died not long ago, and most mysteriously, she suspected poison, encumbered her desk. Nancy was invariably the last of the family to retire, as she had once informed her friend and home economics teacher, Miss Polly Stringer, the midnight hours were her time to be selfish and vain. It was then that she went through her beauty routine, a cleansing, creaming ritual which on Saturday nights included washing her hair. Tonight, having dried and brushed her hair and bound it in a gauzy bandana, she set out the clothes she intended to wear to church the next morning. Nylons, black pumps, a red velveteen dress, her prettiest, which she herself had made. It was the dress in which she was to be buried. Before saying her prayers, she always recorded in a diary a few occurrences. Some were here, forever, I hope. Sue over and we rode Babe down to the river. Sue played her flute, fireflies, and an occasional outburst. I love him, I do. It was a 5-year diary. In the 4 years of its existence, she had never neglected to make an entry, though the splendor of several events. It was a 5-year diary. In the 4 years of its existence, she had never neglected to make an entry, though the splendor of several events. Eviana's wedding, the birth of her nephew, and the drama of others. Her first real quarrel with Bobby, a page literally tear-stained, that caused her to usurp space allotted to the future. A different tinted ink identified each year. 1956 was green, and 1957 a ribbon of red, replaced the following year by bright lavender, and now, in 1959, she had decided upon a dignified blue. But as in every manifestation, she continued to tinker with her handwriting, slanting it to the right or to the left, shaping it roundly or steeply, loosely or stingily, as though she were asking, is this Nancy? Or that? Or that? Which is me. Once Mrs. Riggs, her English teacher, had returned a theme with the scribbled comment, "Good, but why written in 3 styles of scripts?" To which Nancy had replied, "Because I'm not grown up enough to be one person with one kind of signature." Still, she had progressed in recent months, and it was in a handwriting of emerging maturity that she wrote. Jolene Kay came over, and I showed her how to make a cherry pie. Practice with Roxy, Bobby hearing me watch TV, left at 11. This is it, this has to be it. There's the school, there's the garage, now we turn south. To Perry, it seemed as though Dick were muttering jubilant mumbo-jumbo. They left the highway, sped through a deserted Holcomb, and crossed the Santa Fe tracks. The bank, that must be the bank, now we turn west. See the trees? This is it, this has to be it. The headlights disclosed a lane of Chinese elms. Bundles of wind-blown thistles scurried across it. Dick doused the headlights, slowed down, and stopped until his eyes were adjusted to the moon-illuminated night. Presently, the car crept forward. Holcomb is 12 miles east of the Mountain Time Zone border, a circumstance that causes some grumbling, for it means that at 7 in the morning and in winter at 8 or after, the sky is still dark and the stars, if any, are still shining, as they were when the two sons of Vic Earsick arrived to do their Sunday morning chores. But by 9, when the boys finished work, during which they noticed nothing amiss, the sun had risen, delivering another day of pheasant season perfection. As they left the property and ran along the lane, they waved at an incoming car, and a girl waved back. She was a classmate of Nancy Clutter's, and her name was also Nancy Ewalt. She was the only child of the man who was driving the car, Mr. Clarence Ewalt, a middle-aged sugar beet farmer. Mr. Ewalt was not himself a churchgoer, nor was his wife, but every Sunday he dropped his daughter at River Valley Farm in order that she might accompany the Clutter family to Methodist services in Garden City. The arrangement saved him making two back-and-forth trips to town. It was his custom to wait until he had seen his daughter safely admitted to the house. Nancy, a clothes-conscious girl with a film star figure, a respectable countenance, and a cool tiptoe way of walking, crossed the lawn and pressed the front doorbell. The house had 4 entrances, and when, after repeated knockings, there was no response at this one, she moved on to the next, that of Mr. Clutter's office. Here the door was partly open. She opened it somewhat more, enough to ascertain that the office was filled only with shadow. But she did not think the Clutters would appreciate her barging right in. She knocked, rang, and at last walked around to the back of the house. The garage was there, and she noted that both cars were in it, 2 Chevrolet sedans, which meant they must be home. However, having applied unavailingly at the 3rd door, which led into a utility room, and a 4th, the door to the kitchen, she rejoined her father, who said, "Maybe they're asleep." "But that's impossible. Can you imagine Mr. Clutter missing church just to sleep?" "Come on then, we'll drive to the teacherage. Susan ought to know what's happened." The teacherage, which stands opposite the up-to-date school, is an out-of-date edifice, drab and poignant. Its 20-odd rooms are separated into grace and favor apartments for those members of the faculty unable to find or afford other quarters. Nevertheless, Susan Kidwell and her mother had managed to sugar the pill and install a cozy atmosphere in their apartment, 3 rooms on the ground floor. The very small living room incredibly contained, aside from things to sit on, an organ, a piano, a garden of flowering flower pots, and usually a darting little dog and a large, drowsy cat. Susan, on this Sunday morning, stood at the window of this room watching the street. She was a tall, languid young lady with a pallid oval face and beautiful pale blue-gray eyes. Her hands are extraordinary, long-fingered, flexible, nervously elegant. She was dressed for church and expected momentarily to see the Clutter Chevrolet, where she too always attended services chaperoned by the Clutter family. Instead, the Ewalts arrived to tell their peculiar tale. But Susan knew no explanation, nor did her mother, who said if there was some change of plan, why, I'm sure they would have telephoned. "Susan, why don't you call the house? They could be asleep, I suppose." Now this is Susan's statement to the police, but this was after like a while. "So I did," said Susan, in a statement made at a later date. "I called the house and let the phone ring. At least, I had the impression it was ringing. Oh, a minute or more. Nobody answered, so Mr. Ewalt suggested that we go to the house and try to wake them up. But when we got there, I didn't want to do it. Go inside the house. I was frightened, and I didn't know why, because it never occurred to me. Well, something like that just doesn't. But the sun was so bright, everything looked too bright and quiet. And then I saw that all the cars were there, even Kenyon's old coyote wagon. Mr. Ewalt was wearing work clothes. He had mud on his boots. He felt he wasn't properly dressed to go calling on the Clutters, especially since he never had. Been in the house, I mean. Finally, Nancy said she would go with me. We went around to the kitchen door, and of course, it wasn't locked. The only person who ever locked doors around here was Mrs. Helm. The family never did. We walked in, and I saw right away that the Clutters hadn't eaten breakfast. There were no dishes, nothing on the stove. Then I noticed something funny. Nancy's purse. It was lying on the floor, sort of open. We passed on through the dining room and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Nancy's room was just at the top. I called her name and started up the stairs, and Nancy Ewalt followed. The sound of our footsteps frightened me more than anything. They were so loud and everything else was so silent. Nancy's door was open, the curtains hadn't been drawn, and the room was full of sunlight. I don't remember screaming. Nancy Ewalt says I did. Screamed and screamed. I only remember Nancy's teddy bear staring at me, and Nancy, and running. In the interim, Mr. Ewalt had decided that perhaps he ought not to have allowed the girls to enter the house alone. He was getting out of the car to go after them when he heard the screams, but before he could reach the house, the girls were running toward him. His daughter shouted, "She's dead!" and flung herself into his arms. "It's true, Daddy, Nancy's dead!" Susan turned on her. "No, she isn't, and don't you say it. Don't you dare. It's only a nosebleed. She has them all the time, terrible nosebleeds, and that's all it is. There's too much blood. There's blood on the walls. You didn't really look." "I couldn't make head nor tails," Mr. Ewalt subsequently testified. "I thought maybe the child was hurt. It seemed to me the first thing to do was call an ambulance. Miss Kidwell, Susan, she told me there was a telephone in the kitchen. I found it right where she said, but the receiver was off the hook, and when I picked it up, I saw the line had been cut." Larry Hendricks, a teacher of English, age 27, lived on the top floor of the teacherage. He wanted to write, but his apartment was not the ideal layout for a would-be author. It was smaller than the Kidwells, but moreover, he shared it with a wife, 3 active children, and a perpetually functioning television set. It's the only way we can keep the kids pacified. Though as yet unpublished, young Hendricks, a he-managed ex-sailor from Oklahoma who smokes a pipe and has a mustache and a crop of untamed black hair, at least looks literary, in fact, remarkably like youthful photographs of the writer he most admires, Ernest Hemingway. To supplement the teacher's salary, he also drove a school bus. "Sometimes I cover 60 miles a day," he said to an acquaintance, "which doesn't leave much time for writing, except Sundays." Now, that Sunday, November 15th, I was sitting up here in the apartment going through the papers. Most of my ideas for stories, I get them out of newspapers. Well, the TV was on and the kids were kind of lively, but even so, I could hear voices from downstairs, down to Mrs. Kidwell's. But I didn't figure it was my concern, since I was new here, only came to Holcomb when school began. But then Shirley, she'd been out hanging up some clothes. My wife, Shirley, rushed in and said, "Honey, you better go downstairs, they're all hysterical." The 2 girls, now, they were really hysterical. Susan never has got over it. Never will, ask me. And poor Mrs. Kidwell, her health's not too good. She's high-strung to begin with. She kept saying, but it was only later I understood what she meant. She kept saying, "Oh, Bonnie, what happened? You were so happy. You told me it was all over. You said you'd never be sick again." Words to that effect. Even Mr. Ewalt, he was about as worked up as a man like that ever gets. He had the sheriff's office on the phone, the Garden City sheriff, and he was telling them that there was something radically wrong over at the Clutter place. The sheriff promised to come straight out, and Mr. Ewalt said fine, he'd meet him on the highway. Shirley came downstairs to sit with the women, try and calm him, as if anybody could. And I went with Mr. Ewalt, drove with him out to the highway to wait for Sheriff Robinson. On the way, he told me what had happened. When he came to the part about finding the wires cut, right then I thought, and decided I better keep my eyes open. Make a note of every detail, in case I was ever called on to testify in court. The sheriff arrived. It was 9:35. I looked at my watch. Mr. Ewalt waved at him to follow our car, and we drove out to the Clutters. I'd never been there before, only seen it from a distance. Of course, I knew the family. Kenyon was in my sophomore English class, and I directed Nancy in the Tom Sawyer play. But they were such exceptional, unassuming kids, you wouldn't have known they were rich or lived in such a big house. And the trees, the lawn, everything so tended and cared for. After we got there and the sheriff had heard Mr. Ewalt's story, he radioed his office and told them to send reinforcements in an ambulance. He said, "There's been some kind of accident." Then we went in the house, the 3 of us, went through the kitchen and saw a lady's purse lying on the floor and the phone where the wires had been cut. The sheriff was wearing a hip pistol, and when we started up the stairs going to Nancy's room, I noticed he kept his hand on it ready to draw. Well, it was pretty bad, that wonderful girl, but she would never have known her. She'd been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun, held maybe 2 inches away. She was lying on her side, facing the wall, and the wall was covered with blood. The bed covers were drawn up to her shoulders. Sheriff Robinson, he pulled them back, and we saw that she was wearing a bathrobe, pajamas, socks, and slippers. Like, whenever it happened, she hadn't gone to bed yet. Her hands were tied behind her, and her ankles were roped together with the kind of cord you see on Venetian blinds. The sheriff said, "Is this Nancy Clutter?" He'd never seen the child before, and I said, "Yes, that's Nancy." We stepped back into the hall and looked around. All the other doors were closed. We opened one, and that turned out to be a bathroom. Something about it seemed wrong. I decided it was because of the chair, a sort of dining room chair, that looked out of place in the bathroom. The next door, we all agreed, it must be Kenyon's room. A lot of boy stuff scattered around, and I recognized Kenyon's glasses. Saw them on a bookshelf beside the bed. but the bed was empty, though it looked as if it had been slept in. So we walked to the end of the hall, the last door, and there, on her bed, that's where we found Mrs. Clutter. She'd been tied too, but differently, with her hands in front of her so that she looked as though she were praying, and in one hand she was gripping a handkerchief. Or was it a Kleenex? The cord around her wrist ran down to her ankles, which were bound together, and then ran on down to the bottom of the bed, where it was tied to the footboard, a very complicated, artful piece of work. Think how long this took to do! And her lying there, scared out of her wits? Well, she was wearing some jewelry, 2 rings, which is one of the reasons why I've already discounted robbery as a motive, and a robe, and a white nightgown, and white socks. Her mouth had been taped with adhesive, but she'd been shot point blank in the side of the head, and the blast, the impact, had ripped the tape loose. Her eyes were open, wide open, as though she were still looking at the killer. Because she must have had to watch him do it, aimed a gun. Nobody said anything. We were too stunned. I remember the sheriff looked around to see if he could find a discharge cartridge, but whoever had done it was much too smart and cool to have left behind any clues like that. Naturally, we were wondering where was Mr. Clutter, and Kenyon. Sheriff said, let's try downstairs. The first place we tried was the master bedroom, the room where Mr. Clutter slept. The bed covers were drawn back, and lying there towards the foot of the bed was a billfold with a mess of cards spilling out of it, like somebody had shuffled through them hunting something particular. A note, an IOU, who knows? The fact that there isn't any money in it didn't signify one way or the other. It was Mr. Clutter's billfold, and he never did carry cash. Even I knew that, and I'd only been in Holcomb a little more than 2 months. Another thing I knew was that neither Mr. Clutter nor Kenyon could see a darn without his glasses. And there were Mr. Clutter's glasses sitting on a bureau. And there were Mr. Clutter's glasses sitting on a bureau. So I figured, wherever they weren't there of their own accord. We looked all over and everything was just as it should be. No sign of a struggle, nothing disturbed, except the office where the telephone was off the hook. And the wires cut, same as in the kitchen. Sheriff Robinson, he found some shotguns in a closet and sniffed them to see if they had been fired recently. He said they hadn't, and I never saw a more bewildered man. Said, where the devil can there be? About then we heard footsteps, coming up the stairs from the basement. Who's that? Said the sheriff, like he was ready to shoot, and a voice said, it's me, Wendell. Turned out to be Wendell Meyer, the undersheriff. Seems he had come to the house and hadn't seen us, so he'd gone investigating down in the basement. The sheriff told him, and it was sort of pitiful. Wendell, I don't know what to make of it. There's 2 bodies upstairs. Well, he said, Wendell did. There's another one down here. So we followed him down to the basement, or playroom, I guess you'd call it. It wasn't dark. There were windows that let in plenty of light. Kenyon was over in a corner, lying on a couch. He was gagged with adhesive tape and bound hand and foot. Like the mother, the same intricate process of the cord leading from the hands to the feet, and finally tied to an arm of the couch. Somehow he haunts me the most, Kenyon does. I think it's because he was the most recognizable, the one that looked the most like himself, even though he'd been shot in the face directly head on. He was wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans, and he was barefoot, as though he dressed in a hurry, just put on the first thing that came to hand. His head was propped by a couple of pillows, like they'd been stuffed under him to make an easier target. Then the sheriff said, where does this go to? Meaning another door in the basement. The sheriff led the way, but inside you couldn't see your hand until Mr. Ewald found the light switch. It was a furnace room, and very warm. Around here, people just install a gas furnace and pump the gas smack out of the ground. Doesn't cost them a nickel. That's why all the houses are overheated. Well, I took one look at Mr. Clutter, and it was hard to look again. I knew plain shooting couldn't account for that much blood, and I wasn't wrong. He'd been shot all right, the same as Kenyon, with the gun held right in front of his face. But probably he was dead before he was shot. Or, anyway, dying, because his throat had been cut too. He was wearing striped pajamas, nothing else. His mouth was taped, the tape had been wound plumb around his head. His ankles were tied together, but not his hands, or rather, he managed, God knows how, maybe in rage or pain, to break the cord binding his hands. He was sprawled in front of the furnace, on a big cardboard box that looked as though it had been laid there specially, a mattress box. Sheriff said, look here, Wendell. What he was pointing at was a blood-stained footprint on the mattress box. A half-soled footprint with circles, 2 holes in the center like a pair of eyes. Then one of us, Mr. Ewald, I don't recall, pointed out something else, a thing I can't get out of my mind. There was a steam pipe overhead, and knotted to it, dangling from it, was a piece of cord, the kind of cord the killer had used. Obviously, at some point, Mr. Clutter had been tied there, strung up by his hands, and then cut down. But why? To torture him? I don't guess we'll ever know. Ever know who did it, or why, or what went on in that house that night. After a bit, the house began to fill up. Ambulances arrived, and the coroner, and the Methodist minister, a police photographer, state troopers, fellows from the radio, and the newspaper. Oh, a bunch. Most of them had been called out of church and acted as though they were still there. Very quiet, whispery. It was like nobody could believe it. A state trooper asked me did I have any official business there, and said if not, then I'd better leave. Outside on the lawn, I saw the undersheriff talking to a man, Alfred Stokeland, the hired man. Seems Stokeland lived not 100 yards from the Clutter house, with nothing between this place and theirs except a barn. But he was saying as to how he hadn't heard a sound. Said, I didn't know a thing about it till 5 minutes ago when one of my kids come running in and told us the sheriff was here. The missus and me, we didn't sleep 2 hours last night. Was up and down the whole time, on account of we got a sick baby. But the only thing we heard, about 10:30, quarter to 11, heard a car drive away, and I made the remark to the missus, there goes Bob Rupp. I started walking home, and on the way about halfway down the lane, I saw Kenyon's old collie, and that dog was scared. Stood there with its tail between its legs, didn't bark or move, and seeing the dog, somehow that made me feel again. I'd been too dazed, too numb to feel the full viciousness of it all. The suffering, the horror, they were dead. A whole family, gentle, kindly people I knew, murdered. You had to believe it, because it was really true.